Hi, today we're going to talk about how to construct phylogenetic trees and how to read phylogenetic trees. We'll talk a little bit about a few things from chapter 28, including the origin of eukaryotes and some of the protist groups, especially the Archaeplastida, that are going to be important going into the plants section next. So phylogeny is, or aphylogeny, is the history of a particular species. So, and it should represent, a phylogenetic tree should represent what has happened during the course of evolution. And many phylogenetic trees get changed as new data is discovered. It could be new things in the fossil record or new DNA sequencing information. The study of classification systems is called systematics. Now, here's a phylogenetic tree of lizards. Lizards are reptiles. They're only a subset of the reptiles. Things that aren't lizards would be turtles, for example, aren't lizards. And leglessness has evolved several times in reptiles and twice within the lizard lineage. So snakes are probably the most familiar legless reptiles. Snakes are a large and diverse group with thousands of species. But we also have smaller groups that have evolved leglessness or have lost their limbs during the course of evolution, both within reptiles and also within amphibians. There are some legless amphibians as well. So the glass lizards as well are legless lizards that have lost their legs during the course of evolution due to natural selection. Now, what would be the selective pressure that would drive the loss of limbs? It would have to be something that would be a selective advantage. Only things that are a selective advantage would be driven by this kind of evolutionary force. And it turns out that the selective advantage is for burrowing. So lizards and amphibians who burrow in the ground tend to lose their limbs. And not only do we have completely legless reptiles like snakes and glass lizards, but there are also numerous other species of lizards and amphibians, or reptiles and amphibians rather, that have really tiny, reduced, almost vestigial limbs that really aren't functional at all, and they can't walk with them. So this has happened multiple times. And this is an example of what we try to do. This, even though snakes and glass lizards superficially are similar in that they share this trait of having no forelimbs or hind limbs, that's a separate evolutionary paths. These are, and we'll talk about this in a second, this is due to convergent evolution. It's not, it doesn't mean that glass lizards and snakes are close relatives. In fact, glass lizards are more closely related to iguanas and monitor lizards than they are to snakes. So a phylogenetic tree makes that clear. We don't necessarily group things according to all the traits that might be similar, because we're trying to represent what has happened during the course of evolution. The classification system that we use today was first developed by this guy Carl Linnaeus, who you've probably heard of. In fact, we still call it the Linnaean classification system after him. He was a Swedish scientist, mostly interested in botany. His taxonomy of plants is the one that's been altered the least by more recent information, probably because he spent the most time on it. He was a plant guy. But some of the things that he came up with, we absolutely still use today. He came up with the two-word species name, the genus and species epithet, that we still use today for all species. And, you know, so here's our species, Homo sapiens. Homo is the genus, and then sapiens is the species epithet that makes Homo sapiens to specifically describe our species. A genus might have several species in it. It might have only a single species. It might have 1,000 species in a single genus. We are currently the only extant or living species in our genus, but there have been around 20 other species in the genus Homo, but they're all extinct. Homo erectus, Neanderthals, and many others, including some that have just been discovered in the last few years, are also in that genus, but they are extinct. E. coli, the only good way or correct way to abbreviate a species name is to shorten the genus to one letter. So Escherichia coli, which no one wants to write or say, we usually just shorten to E. coli. This is the domestic dog, Canis lupus familiaris, and if you see a third word, that's a subspecies. So Canis lupus is the gray wolf. Dogs are still in the same species with gray wolves. However, they are different enough morphologically, bone structure, that would mean, that we can tell them apart in the fossil record. We can tell if a skull is a dog skull or a wolf skull. So they get a subspecies. They're not different enough yet to be in a distinct species from wolves. So the hierarchical system that Linnaeus came up with, we still use today, which you've probably heard: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. We have added domain above kingdom. We have 3 domains in living things. And we've added a bunch of categories in between because it turned out that these taxa were not enough to fully describe how species are related and what has happened during the course of evolution. So if we have to add something in between, if we have to add a level in between, like if we were going to add one in between phylum and class, we would either call it a subphylum or a superclass. And subphylum tends to be pretty common. For order as well, we would have, if we wanted a category in between order and family, we would call it either a suborder or a superfamily, meaning that a superfamily would have several families of organisms in it. So we still use this classification system today from Linnaeus, but with modifications. So that word taxon, taxon is the singular, is any category. So a kingdom, the animal kingdom, is a taxon. A single species is also a taxon. If it's anything in between, that's what a taxon is, just a category in a phylogenetic tree. The plural would be taxa, because, you know, Latin. So a familiar species would be the African leopard, Panthera pardus. There are the genus Panthera. There are other familiar species in this genus, like African lions are also Panthera. So Panthera doesn't contain a lot of species, a handful of species that probably most of them would be familiar to you. They're in the family Felidae, which is all the cats. So even things that aren't in the genus Panthera but are cat-like would still be in the family Felids. They're in the order Carnivora. And although Linnaeus classified things very strictly based on what he knew about organisms, we now know that not everything that belongs in the order Carnivora is actually a carnivore, like bears. Bears are omnivores. And panda bears aren't even really omnivores. They exist almost exclusively on a plant-based diet, although because they're bears in evolutionary terms, they totally belong in the order Carnivora. So the name of these groups represents something about the common ancestor of everything in that group. It doesn't necessarily define every member of that group. Carnivores are in the class Mammalia. That's also our class. Our order is the primates. Primates includes monkeys and apes. We're all mammals, so mammals are animals that have fur and feed their babies milk. Now, there are a few members of Mammalia that have lost their fur, like the whales. Although whales do still have fur as fetuses, by the time they're born, they've lost that. So, but they're still mammals, even though they have lost one of the defining traits of mammals, because they evolved from a furry, four-legged land animal that fed its baby's milk. Our phylum and the phylum of leopards as well is Chordata. Chordata includes all of the vertebrates, as well as a few types of organisms that don't have a bony backbone, but they do have a notochord, and that's the defining feature of Chordata, is having a notochord. All vertebrates have a notochord early in their development, and there are a few other chordates that have a notochord as an adult as well, and don't have a bony backbone. We're in the animal kingdom, and we're in the domain Eukaryotes. Now you'll notice here's the Latin ending, eukarya. Animalia, those are the Latin endings. It doesn't change the meaning, so don't be thrown off by that. So if you see animals, eukaryotes means exactly the same thing. So when Linnaeus first started to classify things, everything was in two categories. There was only two kingdoms, plants and animals. And everything that was photosynthetic was a plant. Everything that could move was an animal. And this created some problems. Fungi ended up in the plant kingdom because, of course, they can't move. And then this really fell apart at the microscopic level, that the single-celled organisms, whether they're bacteria or protists, lots of them could do both. They both were green and photosynthetic and could also swim. Which category do you put them in? So around 1900, Whitaker came up with a new classification system with 5 kingdoms. One for the prokaryotes, and remember, a prokaryote has no nucleus. Eukaryotes have a nucleus. So the prokaryotes include what we now call bacteria and archaea, but Whitaker put them all in one kingdom. The things without a nucleus, Monera, and then protists, fungi, plants, and animals, which these should be very familiar. In the 1970s, that changed. Carl Woese at the University of Illinois realized that on a molecular level, although archaea look just like bacteria under the microscope, and they're definitely prokaryotes, on a molecular level, they are nothing like bacteria. They are so distantly related from bacteria, they're actually more closely related to the eukaryotes. So he created a new domain, or he created the whole domain system. He said we need a level above kingdom, and archaea needed their own domain and their own kingdom. So this 3-domain system, bacteria, archaea, and eukaryotes, that represent 3 ancient branches during evolution, with archaea and eukaryotes being more closely related. The eukaryotes are actually a branch of the archaea part of the tree of life. So that's only been around since the 1970s. So, but by 1980, this system, the domain system, was the classification system in biology. So if you see anywhere a Wikipedia page or anything that's still using the name Monera, it's 40 years out of date. Don't trust that as a source. That nobody has been using the name Monera in science since the 1980s. So we'll get rid of that. So a phylogenetic tree should represent the best hypothesis about what has occurred during evolution. So phylogenetic trees change. They change with new information, whether it's new fossil discoveries or new DNA sequencing. And there should never be more than 2 branches at a time, because typically, now there's exceptions to this with speciation, but typically branches occur in a bifurcation like that. And we always want to resolve if there's more than 2 branches, because we don't know what exactly happened. That's something that we want more data for if that's the case. So this little phylogeny here shows all the vertebrates. And so we have the most ancient common ancestor here of all the vertebrates would be back here. And it was some sort of a fish. It was a bony fish with a bony backbone. That's the ancestor of all the vertebrates, including us. So bony fish are the most ancient branch here because of that. And then we have the tetrapods here, the land vertebrates. So the oldest land vertebrates are amphibians, not specifically frogs. Frogs happened a little bit later. But amphibians would be the most ancient branch. Then we have reptiles. This ancestor here, this common ancestor, would have been a reptile as well. And there are a lot of things missing on this tree, obviously. But then here we have the mammal lineage here. So groups that are on the same level are called sister taxa. This group here would be a more ancient branch. This branch point would be a more recent branch. And one thing you can see from this that is a common misunderstanding, we did not evolve from chimps. We have a common ancestor with chimps that lived about 8 million years ago that was neither a chimp nor a human. And chimps have been evolving along their own pathway. We've been evolving along our own pathway. There's a lot of extinct branches in here that aren't shown. We don't see a line from chimps to humans. We did not evolve from chimps. They're our closest living relative, but we didn't evolve from them. They're their own endpoint. So phylogenies use two big types of information. One is morphological. Morph just means shape. So morphological could mean bone structure, other physical traits of the organism. That's morphological. Things we see in the fossil record would be morphological. Molecular data would be DNA. And some older stuff was protein sequencing, amino acid sequencing, but now we tend to rely on DNA sequencing because it's cheap and easy. So let's review a little thing about evolution that hopefully you remember from last semester, and that is the difference between homology and analogy. So homologous structures are similar because they had an ancestor who had that structure. So for example, if you look at a human arm and a dolphin flipper, and you look at the bones inside, we see the same bone structure. We have one bone, two bones, some little bones, and then 5 digits. If you look inside the front limb of any cetacean, dolphins or any other whales, you see that same structure. Of course, it's much shorter and it's inside of a flipper. And the reason that those bones are similar is because they are homologous. They're homologous because we share a common ancestor with dolphins that also had one bone, two bones, little bones, and then digits. Structures that are analogous are similar because of convergent evolution, which means similar evolutionary pressure, similar natural selective pressure has created a situation where things look similar just because of similar natural selection. They're not actually closely related. So the snakes and the glass lizards from the first example that both have lost their limbs, that would be analogous. It's not homologous because although they're both in the lizard order, they don't share a common ancestor who was limbless. The common ancestor of snakes and glass lizards had 4 legs. So it's analogous. It's from convergent evolution, the same natural selective pressure for burrowing. Burrowing behavior in reptiles and amphibians seems to lead to leglessness as an advantage. That's a natural selection. Legs just get in your way if you're trying to get into small holes, apparently. So here's another example. So these are 2 African mammals that look similar and have a similar niche in the environment. Anteaters and aardvarks, you probably heard of these. And probably whatever alphabet book you had as a kid had aardvark for A. So anteaters and aardvarks are not closely related at all. They're in different orders of mammals. They're very distantly, they're not any more closely related than humans to mice. That's how distantly related they are. But they eat ants and termites, so they have a lot of similar adaptations. Anteaters and aardvarks both have very big front claws and powerful front legs for digging. They dig into anthills and termite mounds, and they both have elongated snouts and very long tongues. And those are all advantages in their niche, but they are analogous. The common ancestor of anteaters and aardvarks lived about 100 million years ago during the age of the dinosaurs and did not have any of those traits. So that's analogous. The similarities that we see now are analogous. Now, because they're both mammals, anteaters and aardvarks do have some homologous traits as well. They both have fur. That's an ancestral character for mammals. They both feed their babies milk and give birth to live young. Those are ancestral traits of the placental mammals. So they do have both homologous and analogous traits, but their superficial similarity is due to convergent evolution. Cladistics is a specific way of using the information in phylogenies and drawing phylogenetic trees. Cladistics, we want to have every clade, we want to group organisms into named taxa that include every descendant of a particular ancestor. We want all the ancestral species or the ancestral species and all the descendants of that one ancestral species should be in a single named taxa. Now, this doesn't always happen, particularly because we are stuck with a lot of old names from older Linnaean groups, and it's very hard to get things to change. But a lot of phylogenies are changed now to take advantage of this newer philosophy, which cladistics has been around for about 50, 60 years. Okay, so a clade is one ancestor and all its descendants. So you can see here the blue group here and the green group here. These are both clades because they include the ancestor, whatever species that was, and all the descendants are in the same group. And here as well, all in the same group. Now, this group here, this is what we would call a paraphyletic clade because we've left one out. There's one over here, whatever this taxa is, so this yellow box represents a taxa or a taxon, and this group wouldn't be included in that taxon. So this would be like if we had carnivores, but we left out pandas because they are not carnivorous. And we had, here's the order Carnivora, and we're going to put the pandas in a different order because they don't eat meat. That would not be a clade then. This is really bad. This is something we're totally trying to eliminate wherever they are present within current evolutionary theory. And that would be including descendants of two different common ancestors in the same clade. Now, these would be accidental groupings based on morphology that turn out not to really represent what happened during the course of evolution. And that would be a polyphyletic group. We don't want any of those. So a clade, we want all of our clades to be monophyletic, meaning that we have that ancestor and all the descendants of that ancestor are in the group. So mammals, as a group, mammals are monophyletic. There aren't any descendants of the original mammals that aren't included in the group mammals. Vertebrates are monophyletic. So paraphyletic is if you leave out one of the descendants. You leave out one of the descendants for some reason. Usually that reason is historical. And historically they were left out, and it's very hard to get certain things to change depending on what the group is. I'll give you some examples of that we still use. So paraphyletic groups are tolerable. We can tolerate the paraphyletic groups mostly for historical reasons. Polyphyletic groups means we want to eliminate any polyphylies that we find in current phylogenetic trees because they absolutely do not help us understand what happened during evolution, and they don't represent what happened during evolution. It's the artificial grouping together of things based on a trait that they evolved independently. So a polyphyletic group would be if we group together all of the legless reptiles into one single group and called it the legless reptiles, and we included glass lizards and snakes and together. That would not be good. We don't want to do that. We try to eliminate those whenever they are found. So monophyletic, this is ideal. We want everything to be monophyletic within evolutionary theory. And mostly that's the case because of all the repairs that evolutionary biologists have been doing over the last 50 years. Paraphyletic groups, we tolerate paraphyletic groupings mostly because of historical reasons. These aren't ideal, but it's tolerable. And a good example of this would be reptiles leave out birds. So birds are the direct descendants of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs, so if we can imagine F here would be dinosaurs. Birds are the direct descendants of dinosaurs. So we have a group here that includes dinosaurs, reptiles, but does not include descendants of that group. So that would be, so birds are kind of a famous example now of a paraphyletic group that we tolerate because the category was created by Linnaeus and everybody loves birds. So it's very hard to change their order. Aves, they have their own order. So we shouldn't have one order embedded in another order, reptiles. So polyphyletic groups, these we are definitely not tolerable. So if polyphyletic groups are discovered, like there was a Linnaean category for aquatic mammals, and whales and seals were grouped together, that was polyphyletic because seals are actually carnivores. Seals are more closely related to lions than they are to whales. So seals are now in the carnivore order, and whales are more closely related to four-legged, hoofed mammals. In fact, hippos are their closest relative. So we no longer, like Linnaeus did, would classify whales and seals together, although they look really similar, don't they? They have streamlined bodies and they have reduced limbs, and they swim similarly in the water with their, well, seals still have hind limbs that they use kind of like the whale's back flipper. The back flipper of a whale here is actually what's left of their, it's part of their tail, actually. So seals don't use their tail, they use their flippers. So this is, this would be, the similarities between cetaceans and seals is analogous. It's an example of convergent evolution because of similar selective pressure, and we should not put them in a category together like Linnaeus did. So seals are carnivores and whales belong with even-toed ungulates, although officially cetaceans still are their own group. So this is paraphyletic, but having a paraphyletic group here with cetaceans is better. And we'll put seals right into the carnivores because that's where they belong. All right, so when we're looking at phylogenetic trees and the characteristics, the traits of the different species, there are ancestral traits and derived characters or derived traits. And a derived trait is something that appeared in a particular branch, a particular selected for trait. So leglessness in snakes would be a derived character of the snake lineage that's not shared by lizards. A shared ancestral trait would be something that's shared by most members of the group. So within the lizard lineage that I showed you, a shared ancestral trait would be to have 4 limbs. So even though snakes and glass lizards have lost that trait, an ancestral trait for the lizard lineage would be having 4 limbs. For any trait, if we're talking about a particular lineage like lizards, we want to ask what was the ancestor of this group like? And species that have those ancestral characters have a shared ancestral character. They have it because their ancestor had it and they never lost it. Derived character is something that we only find that evolved a novelty in a particular branch. And sometimes derived characters evolve multiple times in the same group, like leglessness in lizards. And this can be very confusing sometimes for evolutionary biologists who get fooled by the similarity between species that is actually derived characters that appeared multiple times. DNA can help us tease out which of those species are actually closely related and which just look similar because of convergent evolution. So here's our phylum again, Chordata, or the chordates if you want to say the English ending. And here's one of those groups that is not a vertebrate. So lancelets are little fish-like organisms that don't have a bony backbone, but they do have a notochord. They have a notochord. We only have a notochord as an embryo. They have a notochord that persists into adulthood, and that's what stiffens their body. Chordates first appeared during the Cambrian explosion over 500 million years ago, and they are the most like, the lancelets are most like the ancestral chordate that lived at that time, 500 million years ago. Then here we have the evolutionary novelty here for the vertebrates, having a bony backbone that protects the nerve cord. And the most ancient vertebrates are the jawless fishes like lampreys and hagfish. They don't have a bony lower jaw. Instead, they just have a soft, muscular mouth, but they don't have any bone in their lower jaw. So bony fish evolved the bony lower jaw first. From them evolved tetrapods, so 4 limbs and living on land. That was the tetrapods, with amphibians again. And then reptiles were the first ones to have an egg that was protected from drying out. So you might know amphibians have to lay their eggs in water or in a very wet environment. They don't have a shell or an amnion on their egg to prevent desiccation or drying out. So reptiles, that was a new invention in the reptile lineage. So everything beyond that is a descendant of this common ancestor who laid eggs with a shell, and originally the shell was kind of a leathery, rubbery shell, but it protected eggs from drying out. Turtles being one of the oldest reptile lineages that still exists today. And then in mammals, there's other things with mammals other than hair. But this just shows you how we categorize these characters. And which ones are shared ancestral characters. So for reptiles, laying eggs with an amnion, that's a shared ancestral character for reptiles. Even though some reptiles have evolved keeping their young internally and giving birth to live babies, that has evolved multiple times. And that would be a derived character in those particular organisms. Sometimes we use phylogenetic trees to show how long ago particular species diverged. So in this case, the branches aren't just drawn evenly. The branch points are pinned to this x-axis down here, showing when the species diverged. So if we follow, humans all the way back to here, and here's Drosophila, which is an insect. The last time we shared a common ancestor with insects was before the Cambrian explosion, because the first chordates, which, remember, the lancelet is a chordate, that's our phylum. The last time we shared an ancestor with Drosophila was before the Cambrian explosion, so that would have been during the Ediacaran period before the Cambrian explosion. So here we have the first chordates appearing during the Cambrian explosion, and we still have organisms that are very much like those first chordates that still live today. And then the first vertebrates appeared about 400 million years ago, and they were bony fish. The first vertebrates, the first amphibians, about 350 million years ago. First reptiles, slightly later than that, 325 million years ago. And the first mammals were actually back here about 100 million years ago, well before the extinction of the dinosaurs. Separation of primates, first appearance of primates, shortly after the extinction of the dinosaurs, about 55 million years ago. So that's a separation here. So we can also use dates with phylogenetic trees and show them this way. So birds are one of the famous examples here of a group that is a problem for cladistics, because if we have an order, the order of reptiles includes crocodiles, who are the closest living relative to dinosaurs other than birds. Birds, we now know, evolved from the theropod dinosaurs, but all of the dinosaurs other than birds have gone extinct. So this is a problem, having multiple orders that the common ancestor is included here, but birds are not. Birds have their own order of AB. So it's paraphyletic, and that's not ideal, but if birds weren't a well-known order, probably this would have been fixed a long time ago. But when you have a group that's so well-known, like obviously birds are, things don't change. It is probably never going to change. They're probably never going to put birds in the dinosaur order. That's not going to happen. But one of the things we can learn from this is that we can try to figure out what traits the common ancestor of crocodiles and birds had. And whatever traits we think crocodiles and birds have in common, probably all the dinosaurs had those traits too. And warm-bloodedness of the dinosaurs has been one thing that's been very talked about, and at least the theropod dinosaurs, which are the direct ancestors of birds, had feathers and were warm-blooded like birds are. There's a lot of evidence for care of offspring and nest guarding in dinosaurs, and crocodilians had that as well. Some of the other traits that they share, one is a 4-chambered heart. So other reptiles have a 3-chambered heart, not a 4-chambered heart. Amphibians have a 3-chambered heart. So also, besides having a 4-chambered heart, making vocalizations or singing in regards to territoriality, for mates, communicating with their offspring. You might not know that, but crocodile babies make sounds that call their parents, and parents make sounds to call the babies. And birds do that as well. So that probably means that dinosaurs did that too, because if that's a trait of the entire group, probably most members of that group shared that trait. And we do have evidence of large brooding colonies of particular species of dinosaurs with nests of eggs and evidence that adults of that species were guarding the nests because large volcanic eruptions wiped them all out, and everybody is where they were when the eruption happened, and all of them died in an instant. So very interesting. So those are the kind of conclusions we can draw when we draw these phylogenies correctly and represent what actually happened during evolution. We can learn things that we really couldn't learn any other way. Okay, so here's all of the living things here. Now, in this semester, we're going to first talk about plants and then animals. So this is within the domain of eukaryotes. And if you'll notice here, this is something that we really would like to avoid in evolution, and that is having the kingdom of protists has 3 other kingdoms embedded in it. That is not good cladistics. So currently, the protists are being broken up into 4 big supergroups, which you probably heard about in 1151. And we're going to talk about one supergroup first, the Archaeplastida. And fungi and animals are actually descended from the same supergroup, the Eukaryotes. So we're more closely related to mushrooms than we are to plants, which is interesting. Okay, so here is all of the eukaryotes again. We left off the bacteria and the archaea here. So this is actually from chapter 28, although I'm not going to officially say we're doing chapter 28 because we're just doing this tiny little review bit from chapter 28. Okay, so in 1151 we talked about the 4 big supergroups of protists, the excavata, SAR, which is an acronym for straminopiles, alveolata, and rhizarians, the Archaeplastida, which includes the green and red algae, and also plants, because plants, if we draw this according to what happened during evolution, plants directly come out of the Archaeplastida. And then the Eukaryotes, which includes all the amoeba-like things, and our closest protist relative, the choanoflagellates, and fungi also are in the same group. The opisthecants, which is a subgroup of the eukaryotes, we're in the same subgroup with the fungi. But we'll talk about the Archaeplastida first, because we're going to plants first, and then we'll talk about animals in the subsequent, in Module 2, we'll talk about animals. So let's review the origin of eukaryotes. So our closest prokaryotic relatives are the archaea, not bacteria. And in fact, a newly discovered archaea called the Loki archaea is even more like eukaryotes than any other archaea that has been discovered yet. This is just in the last couple of years it's been discovered. They do have infoldings of their wall. So the first thing that evolved among eukaryotes was the nuclear membrane, which is the defining characteristic of eukaryotes. Eu means true or good, and karyo is nucleus. So eukaryotes have a true nucleus. So the nucleus evolved first, probably as protection against viruses. Prokaryotes are constantly attacked by DNA viruses, many of which destroy their genome and take over the machinery of the cell. Eukaryotes are pretty much protected from those kind of viruses because the viruses cannot cross the membrane. So the nuclear membrane probably evolved as a protection from viruses. And it evolved first. And that's kind of a recent, due to DNA analysis of many, many, many eukaryotes, they were able to determine that. Very likely the first eukaryotic cell had a nucleus, but no mitochondria. So the second step was endosymbiosis. So endo means in, symbio means live together. So endosymbiosis means another organism lived inside of a second organism. And for eukaryotes, that was an aerobic bacteria that we now know was an alpha proteobacteria. And the exact species is probably extinct. But the closest relatives of mitochondria are the alpha proteobacteria. And so an alpha proteobacteria was engulfed by one of these early eukaryotic cells, and instead of being eaten, it lived in the cytoplasm, reproduced in the cytoplasm, lost most of its genes. So a typical alpha proteobacteria has about 3,000 genes, and our mitochondria only have about 20. So if you remember, mitochondria have their own circular DNA chromosomes that have bacterial genes on them. They have their own ribosomes inside the mitochondria, and those ribosomes are bacterial ribosomes, not eukaryotic ribosomes. And they are, in fact, ancient bacteria. This happened about 2 billion years ago. And then this cell would have been the ancestor of all the eukaryotes that are alive today. Later, one of these early eukaryotic cells that had a mitochondria already engulfed a cyanobacteria. And this cyanobacteria became the ancestor of all of the chloroplasts and other plastids that are found in plants and algae today. And chloroplasts, just like mitochondria, have DNA chromosomes, little circular chromosomes. They have lost a lot of the genes on those chromosomes. A lot of the genes have been transferred to the nucleus of the organism that it finds itself in. Some cells have a single chloroplast. Some cells have hundreds of chloroplasts. And same with mitochondria, although mitochondria tend to be smaller than chloroplasts, so cells tend to have a lot more of them. Thousands tend to be inside of a typical eukaryotic cell. But now here we have the ancestor of the Archaeplastida, and the name of the protist group, Archaeplastida. Archae, that root means, it can either mean first or ancient. And so here it means first. So the Archaeplastida means first plastid. So the Archaeplastida had the first plastids, and this one without the plastids is the ancestor of all the other protists and animals and fungi that don't have plastids. There was also some secondary endosymbiosis in the protists, which, just to review this real quickly, so here is our original endosymbiosis here of a cyanobacteria. So this little cell here would be the ancestor of the Archaeplastida. Archaeplastida include the red and the green algae. Red algae, the eukaryotic red algae, was engulfed by two different groups in the SAR, Straminopiles and alveolates, which many of them have chloroplasts in them. What they actually have is an entire red algae in them. There were also secondary endosymbiotic events with green algae, which led to the green euglena, which are in the excavata, another group within the protists, and also a subset of the rhizaria, which are the third one in the SAR in protists. So not all rhizaria have this, only a subgroup here, chlorarachneophytes. Chlor means green. Chlorarachneophytes in the rhizaria had a secondary endosymbiotic event here. So everything in the protists that has the ability to photosynthesize, in other words, has that ability because of the Archaeplastida and that first cell. So if it's not in the Archaeplastida, it engulfed a member of the Archaeplastida. So in the next section, which we're going to go to chapter 29 and chapter 30, we're going to talk about the evolution of plants. And you'll notice here again, here's another paraphyletic group here. We have the green algae, which includes many aquatic species, some of which are like the charophytes that are multicellular, and then the plants. And the charophytes are considered the closest cousin to land plants. But really, the plant kingdom is embedded within the protist kingdom because of this, and that's never optimal. But again, this is not going to change. Okay, so next we're going to talk about this, how we went from this ancient ancestor here, which was like a charophyte and lived in the water, to an organism that was photosynthetic and could live on land, which meant it had to evolve a way to not dry out in the air. Because in general, algae don't have any way to not dry out. Okay, so that's the next chapter, chapter 29. We'll talk about plant evolution.